Somewhere in your kitchen right now there is probably a stick of butter, a block of cheese, or a cut of meat with a thick white rim of fat around the edge. For most of the last 60 years, doctors have told you that fat is exactly what is trying to kill you. But scroll through any nutrition forum today and you will hear the opposite. That saturated fat was never really the villain, that it got blamed for a crime someone else committed, and that cutting it out barely matters at all. So which is it? Is that pat of butter on your toast quietly shortening your life? Or is it an innocent bystander in a story that picked the wrong suspect decades ago? To answer that, it helps to go back to where the fear of fat actually started, because the real story is stranger and messier than most people realize. In the 1950s, an American physiologist named Ancel Keys noticed that heart disease rates varied wildly from country to country, and he suspected diet was the reason. He eventually compared diets across 7 countries, from Finland to Japan, and found that nations eating more saturated fat tended to have more heart disease. That single study helped launch decades of public health guidance, telling people to eat less of it. Governments built entire food pyramids around the idea. Butter got replaced with margarine, whole milk got replaced with skim, and red meat got pushed to the edge of the plate. What if the guidance that has shaped diets for 70 years, telling millions of people to fear butter and steak, turned out to be resting on weaker evidence than almost anyone assumes? That question got personal in the 1980s and 90s, when margarine was marketed everywhere as the heart-healthy stand-in for butter. Here is the twist nobody saw coming. A lot of that early margarine was loaded with artificial trans fats, a manufactured fat that turned out to be far worse for the heart than the butter it replaced. It took until the 2010 for most countries to finally ban artificial trans fats from the food supply, decades after millions of people had already made the swap. So before trusting any confident nutrition advice, including the advice in the rest of this video, it is worth remembering that story. Being right about the destination does not mean every direction along the way was correct. To understand where saturated fat actually fits into all of this, it helps to know what physically is, not just what it has been accused of. Fat is built from chains of carbon atoms. In saturated fat, every carbon atom is fully packed, or saturated, with hydrogen, which makes the chain straight and lets the molecules stack together tightly. That is exactly why butter, cheese, and the white fat on a steak stay solid at room temperature. Unsaturated fat, the kind found in olive oil, nuts, and fish, has kinks in its chain where hydrogen is missing, so its molecules cannot pack together as tightly. That is why olive oil stays liquid in the bottle, instead of turning solid like butter. That structural difference changes how these fats behave once they are inside your bloodstream, especially how they interact with cholesterol, the waxy substance your liver uses to build cells and hormones. Saturated fat tends to raise LDL cholesterol, often nicknamed the bad cholesterol, because too much of it can settle into artery walls and slowly build up as plaque. That plaque buildup is the basic mechanism behind most heart attacks and many strokes. Cardiovascular disease is not some rare or exotic risk. It is the single leading cause of death on the entire planet, ahead of every type of cancer combined, and it costs health systems staggering sums every year in treatment and lost work. Major health organizations, including the American Heart Association and the European Society of Cardiology, have long recommended replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fat, specifically to lower that risk. But here is the detail those organizations rarely lead with. A lot of the evidence behind that advice is not as airtight as a recommendation delivered with that much confidence would suggest. Randomized trials, where researchers control what people eat and compare the results, are the gold standard of medical evidence. But they are expensive and nearly impossible to enforce perfectly, because nobody can lock a person in a lab for a decade. So most of what we know about diet and long-term health actually comes from a weaker kind of evidence: observational studies, where researchers simply track what people already eat and watch what happens to them over time. The trouble with that approach is one of the oldest traps in science. People who eat less saturated fat often also exercise more, smoke less, and see doctors more regularly. Any of those habits, not the fat itself, could be driving the results. It is a bit like noticing that people who own running shoes tend to live longer, and concluding the shoes themselves are medicine. And there is another wrinkle worth knowing. Even the reviews meant to check the quality of medical evidence keep finding that most healthcare recommendations, in nutrition and far beyond it, are backed by lower quality evidence than doctors and patients would like to assume. So here is a question worth sitting with. If the science behind cutting saturated fat is this tangled, has anyone actually gone back and stress tested 70 years of separate, scattered studies all at once, using the same ruler? That is exactly what a team of researchers in Peru set out to do, and the way they did it is different from a normal study. Instead of running one new experiment, they gathered every major review of the evidence on saturated fat and heart disease published over the previous decade, and combined them into one giant analysis of the analyses, an approach scientists call an umbrella review. It is the research equivalent of asking dozens of separate juries, who each already reached their own verdict, to sit in the same room and see whether their conclusions actually agree with each other. They ended up combining 21 previous reviews, covering everything from tightly controlled clinical trials to decades-long tracking studies, representing well over 480,000 people in total. Here is what they found, broken into two very different stories. Start with the strongest evidence: randomized trials, where people were actually assigned to cut back on saturated fat or to keep eating as usual, and then followed for up to 9 years. Across more than 56,000 people in that category, cutting saturated fat lowered the combined rate of cardiovascular events, things like heart attacks and chest pain from blocked arteries, by 21%. Total cholesterol dropped, LDL cholesterol dropped, and even body weight and body mass index dropped in the group that ate less saturated fat. That is a real, measurable, meaningful protective effect, and it comes from the best quality evidence available. So does that settle it? Does eating less saturated fat also mean you personally get to live longer because of it? Surprisingly, no. In those same randomized trials, death from any cause, death specifically from heart disease, and deaths from cancer were all statistically identical between the group that cut saturated fat and the group that did not. The researchers point out that 9 years might simply be too short a window. Heart disease that quietly starts building in your 30s or 40s often does not actually kill someone until decades later, long after most trials have already ended and been published. Then there is the second, messier half of the story: the long-term observational studies, the ones simply tracking what real people already eat in the real world for up to 3 decades at a time. In those studies, people eating more saturated fat did have a 10% higher relative rate of dying, specifically from coronary heart disease, and a striking 51% higher relative rate of dying from breast cancer compared to people eating less. But once again, when the researchers looked at deaths from any cause or from cardiovascular disease overall in those same long-running studies, they found no significant difference either. And then comes the strangest finding in the entire review. People eating more saturated fat in these observational studies actually had a lower rate of stroke than people eating less, a pattern the researchers themselves could not fully explain. That twist is a perfect example of why correlation is not causation. Observational studies compare people who already ate differently, not people randomly assigned to a diet, so factors like income, diet quality, or exercise can quietly ride along and shape the outcome. Tellingly, the tool the researchers used to grade study quality rated the vast majority of those long-term observational reviews as critically low confidence, while the randomized trial evidence on cardiovascular events scored moderate to high. Put it all together, and the honest answer sounds less like a headline and more like real science. Cutting saturated fat probably does protect your heart, lowering your risk of a cardiovascular event by a meaningful margin, but it does not appear to add years to your life overall. The researchers themselves stop short of telling everyone to follow the exact same rule. They argue that blanket limits on saturated fat should give way to advice tailored to a person's actual health status, income, and existing risk factors, rather than one number applied to everyone equally. So the next time you reach for the butter, the science does not say it is harmless, and it does not say it is a death sentence either. It is one ingredient among many, in a much longer story about how you actually choose to live. The findings come from Adolfo Aramburu and colleagues, published in Frontiers in Public Health in 2024.